Here we go again, because the Syrian civil war has exploded again, leading to the United States Air Force executing an A-10 Warthog gun run against Iranian-backed proxy militias. Just when you think the A-10 is ready to retire, it comes out swinging. The strike also KOed 3 rocket artillery trucks, a T-64 tank, and an armored personnel carrier, as well as a mortar battery. Today I want to try to untangle this absolute clusterfuck of a situation and investigate whether the US really backed the rebels to overthrow Assad, why did Syria, Russian, and Iranian forces fail to hold the line, and who is this mysterious rebel group that's taken over the country? All these questions are important, but I think one of the most important things to keep in our mind here is hopefully the Syrian people end up better off from before and that they benefit from this. Maybe it's naive of me to hope for that, but it's easy to forget with all this talk of geopolitics and battles that we're going to get into, that there are 23 million Syrian lives affected by all of this and what the outcome's going to be here. So according to the United States Central Command, these airstrikes had nothing to do with supporting the rebels overthrowing the country and were all about self-defense. They claim that the gun run was to neutralize an imminent threat that was aimed at the nearby military support site codenamed Euphrates, which is a US-led coalition base that's traded fire with ISIS and Iranian proxies before in the past. But journalists and defense analysts alike suspect that the US Central Command isn't telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth here. But first, when I was younger, I was really stupid and I got myself into a ton of debt. Yes, the heavy word that can feel like a huge weight on your shoulders, especially around the holidays. Did you know that last year over half of American consumers took on new debt during the holiday season? It's easy to get caught up in the joy of giving gifts to other people. And before we know it, those bills start to pile up. But here's the good news. PDS Debt is here to help. PDS Debt specializes in creating personalized options to manage and reduce debt. Whether you're dealing with credit card balances, personal loans, collections, or even those lingering medical bills, they have options customized just for you. And get this, if you have $10,000 or more in eligible debt, you qualify. Plus, there's no minimum credit score needed. Trust me, taking the first step is a huge game changer for peace of mind. So why wait? Take control of your finances today. Get a free debt analysis at pdsdebt.com/task23. Just takes 30 seconds to start. Visit pdsdebt.com/task23 and start your journey to financial relief. There have been many days of speculation after video footage of an A-10 Warthog doing gun runs leaked out on X and Telegram. It showed that the aircraft allegedly was attacking a convoy of Iranian militia fighters. According to OSINT Defender on X, the A-10 strafing run on November 30th took out over 50 militants and more than 12 trucks and gun-armed technicals. Or, as we like to say, good effects on target, huh? So coalition air and artillery strikes also destroyed enemy militia barracks and command bunkers. So all of this increased US military activity in Syria happened to come at the same time as a shocking Islamist rebel group captured the major city of Aleppo within a day. They caught the pro-Syrian government defenders completely by surprise. The Pentagon released a statement insisting that the US airstrikes weren't acting in direct support of the rebel assault. But people are skeptical of this because the US they got motivations. They would love to see Iranian proxies and Assad thrown out and destroyed. And while that may not be the case this time, you can understand why people might think that, because the CIA has reportedly tried to overthrow Assad in the past with a failed weapons program in 2015. So US military general Major Pat Ryder stated, "I think there's been a lot of misreporting out there in terms of A-10s and what it was doing and what it wasn't doing. A-10 aircraft were used in self-defense strikes to take out a target, some individuals that were building a rocket rail to threaten MSS Euphrates. And so those are the facts. Again, not related to what's going on in northwestern Syria. That was self-defense to protect our forces." End quote. I'll just give you my personal read on American intervention in Syria. I think we shouldn't be there militarily at all at this point. It made sense for a period of time when we were fighting ISIS, but it's time to go. The mission is over. Take the legit W, guys. I do understand the counter theories to that there are security benefits to staying in Syria, especially for some of our allies, but I think in the overall cost-benefit analysis, it probably makes sense for us to leave Syria now. But if we absolutely have to be there, the United States, then hopefully we can use our power to help the Syrian people get the form of government and future that they want instead of the one that we want. We know there are 900 US troops approximately currently in eastern Syria. Washington claims that these forces remain there after helping defeat ISIS in 2017 and that they're the vestiges of that operation. The argument is if they leave, ISIS could resurge again. However, you should be aware there are a lot of Americans who question why we're still in the Middle East at all. Some analysts believe the real reason the US is there is to protect oil fields and prevent Iranian weapon shipments from passing through with impunity. The main evidence provided is that the US-backed SDF attacked 7 key villages in the eastern part of the country against Iranian proxy militias, who are dug in along the banks of the Euphrates River. This led to some journalists to speculate if the American air power is actually aiding the SDF directly and not just acting in self-defense like the Pentagon claims. It's difficult to untangle. It could be both self-defense and a little bit of convenient target of opportunity to support their advance. There's been a lot of fire back and forth here for years, so this isn't exactly unusual. It might just be that we're paying closer attention. I think America would need to dedicate a lot more air power to really have an impact on the ground though, and the factions that may take power here might not necessarily end up being better for the United States. However, it is true that the main objective of the SDF offensive are militia strongholds around Deir Ezzor Airport, which overlooks a series of major crossroads that connect central and eastern Syria that we'll talk about in a second. And social media reports from the past few days suggest that the US aircraft targeted one of the bridges used by Iranian militia forces. And other accounts have noted that the timing of the airstrikes lines up with convoys of Iranian-backed militias entering from Iraq on their way to aid the Syrian government forces in the northwest. So the argument there is that these are strategic strikes to change the picture of the battlefield and not just defensive ones. But it's not just the United States acting here, and so I think it's important for us to try to untangle this twisted web that we weave. Here is the current state of play. The Syrian civil war has been locked in a tense stalemate for years, largely staying the same territorially since 2020. Prior to that, everyone was saying how the leader of the Syrian government, Assad, had been welcomed back diplomatically into the world community, now that they'd tamed the rebellion and that they had regained control of most of the country. The Assad government, backed by Russia and Iran, controlled most of central and southern Syria, while the US-backed Kurds and Syrian Democratic Forces controlled the northeast. Turkey and their own network of rebel groups controlled segments of the north. Other rebel factions controlled Idlib province in the northwest. And Israel controlled the Golan Heights in the far southwestern corner of the country. ISIS and the other rebel forces held out in pockets throughout the country, but the 3 largest cities of Damascus, Aleppo, Homs were all firmly in Bashar al-Assad's hands. Now, that wasn't so bad to untangle all of that. It's all now neat and sorted, isn't it? But that all changed, and basically the Settlers of Catan board was flipped upside down when on November 27, 2024, a network of rebel groups calling themselves the Military Operations Command, very, very creative name, stormed out of the Idlib province and the Turkish-controlled north, clashing with Syrian government and Russian forces along the way to the city of Aleppo. At the head of the rebel coalition is a Sunni Islamist militia, which goes by the initials HTS for short, because if I pronounce their name or even try, I might have a stroke. Now, I think it's really important we interrogate who HTS is, because they're the big boys in charge now. Basically, the Cliff Notes version is that the HTS broke off from Al-Qaeda and their rivals with ISIS and Assad. A more deep understanding, though, comes from the Atlantic article written by Qutbah Idlibi. Now, they wrote that, quote, they abandoned Al-Qaeda cross-national jihadism ideology. HTS has announced its willingness to dissolve itself again and work with partners on the ground to develop a more representative governing structure, in what seems to be a signal of its pragmatism towards the European Union and the United States, so it sounds like they want to play nice. They're willing to do what it takes to take over. However, like everything in Syria, it's not that simple, because they've been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States and the UN. This matters because the United States has its hands tied basically diplomatically when it comes to negotiating or working with terror groups. You're not allowed to do it. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that they had made contact with HTS, though, which kind of suggests that they might be breaking down those barriers and getting ready to change their minds on all of that. Now, whenever something like this happens, it seems to point out the absolute absurdity of some international relations. One day they're a terror group, the next day they're our best friends that we might be asked to die for. However, it's true that by 2022, HTS had disavowed international terrorism and focused their mission solely on overthrowing the al-Assad regime. They even made diplomatic moves to the Kurdish territories in the east, pledging that Kurds and Christians alike would be respected anywhere HTC held dominion. Exactly how much of that pledge HTS will honor once it achieves its ambitions is an open question, though, and from what I understand, they remain driven by Islamist philosophy that puts them at the top of the food chain. What's really blown me away, though, personally, when looking at them from the point of view of just an average infantryman, is just how much they've tactically transformed over a few short years. They're estimated to have about 15,000 fighters. These fighters have transformed recently into a disciplined, adaptive, and well-armed force that employs much more sophisticated tactics, like better than just simple raids and kamikaze bombings. Images coming out recently have shown they're well-armed with foreign-supplied weapons, plus captured weapons from Syrian and Russian equipment. I mean, they're kitted out with Gucci-level gear that would make any top-level military cosplayer blush. HTS has now built and runs training for their own drone force. Their elite units have night vision-equipped fighters nicknamed the Thermal Brigades. This has led to speculation that they were once stood up by foreign intelligence agencies, so people believe that these groups were stood up by, like, the CIA, who I can confirm. I know that they wish that they were able to stand up a force like this that looks so squared away. I happen to know that that's someone's wet dream at Langley. Spooks aside, though, what we know for sure happened was on early morning hours of November 27th. These special units of night fighters and drone operators infiltrated the pro-government lines and wreaked havoc among the defenders before the main advance reached them. Meanwhile, rebel sleeper cells and spies were activated within Aleppo, creating confusion behind enemy lines, slowing down any pro-Syrian government reinforcements. It's like they combined all the elements that worked from Ukraine's incursion into Kursk and Hamas's October 7th blitz attack. Everyone wants to know, how were these rebels able to breeze through here? Well, because initial reports coming out are suggesting that Assad's government forces were not getting paid, or paid very, very little. And as a soldier, you don't like that. Apparently, troops want to get paid. And this is extremely demoralizing for a force that was supposed to be the winners here. They were the ones that were on the offensive and winning, and so they were expecting, hey, maybe we'll get something in return for that. When you win, you're supposed to see life's conditions improve, but instead they got worse. This led to many desertions among the ranks in the Syrian forces. Now, the financial situation of Syria has been blamed on US economic sanctions, but Assad also has to take some credit here. He should take a bow as well, because there are reports that him and his inner circle were enriching themselves more in just the past few years than ever before. It was like they were raiding it on their way out. So soldiers noticed this disparity. Now, us grunts might be slow, but we're not entirely window-licking slow. Many of the Syrian soldiers were conscripts who were poorly motivated and poorly trained. They saw Assad was getting richer while they were getting treated like garbage. This next part explains why Syria is so important to Iran, Russia, the United States, and just about everybody. And a lot of it has to do with this town of Homs of 1.5 million people. Strategically, it also serves as a gateway between Damascus, the capital, in the south, and Aleppo in the north, which are Syria's two largest cities. From a military logistics point of view, it plays a major role as a central node. It's a major transportation and logistics hub in Syria. What all that means is that control of Homs, the city, ensures secure movement of troops, supplies, and resources between two major regions, and it cuts off your adversary's ability to do the same. Here's when it all clicked for me in my head. Look at how you cannot get from the capital of Damascus to Russia's naval base in Tartus, or their air base in Khemimim, without going through Homs. The HTS fighters accomplished this sweeping move by bypassing the most heavily fortified positions. Then they isolated strongest pro-Assad forces while the momentum of the advance swept the offensive. Within the first 10 hours of the offensive, the rebels had captured 20 towns and the headquarters of the Syrian army's 46th Regiment. Rebels effectively used rocket and artillery fire against the toughest resistance. But the rapid breakthrough caught even the Russian forces by surprise. Early reports indicate an entire convoy of elite Russian Spetsnaz troops were eliminated in an ambush about 10 kilometers outside Aleppo. Russia pledged to send more troops to bolster the Syrian army within the next 72 hours. But with the majority of Russian forces stuck fighting in Ukraine, the public statements don't necessarily specify the numbers and equipment Putin's going to spare for Syria's defense. And very quickly it became clear they weren't going to spare anything, and they only were able to do some limited airstrikes that didn't have much of an impact. Hey, I get it, guys. I mean, I have a point of reference for this. If anyone can understand and knows what it's like to see billions and billions of dollars worth of investment into a foreign force go up in flames, it's the United States with their experience in Afghanistan. Russian forces were reportedly withdrawing through rebel checkpoints, though. Friend of the show, Preston Stewart, pointed out on X how they were waving goodbye to the Russians. Politely. The same people that they've been bombing for the past 10-something years. That's right, the only way that these Russian troops could leave was by going through rebel positions. That's nothing more awkward than making eye contact with the opposing forces on the way out. So why didn't the rebels shoot at them as they were leaving? Possibly because they might want to leave the door open for working with them in the future. Currently, according to satellite images, Russian forces are breaking down helicopters, loading them up on airplanes, and their convoys are leaving the country. The argument I've heard here is that for the past few years, wars have degraded the military and political influence of Assad regime's best friends. Russia has been directly involved in supporting al-Assad since 2015, Iran's been there since like 2012, Hezbollah is tied up fighting Israel, and Russia is fighting Ukraine. So is all of that a determining factor here? I looked closer and there does seem to be some evidence that troop numbers have been lowered and bases have been closed from like 132 to 105 for Russia, and Russia went from like 4,000 soldiers down to an estimate of 2,000 now. However, I don't know how much of that is because they reduced presence because they couldn't sustain it because of fighting in Ukraine, or because of the security situation had gotten far better and more quiet over the past 5 years. From what I've read in the Russian information space from their diplomats and foreign affairs officers, they believe Syria is no longer worth it. Now, the Kremlin didn't return my calls when I inquired for more details, so I have no way to be certain on my assessment. The claim made by many journalists, though, in opinion pieces, is that the rebels sensed that Syria's support was drying up. There was this je ne sais quoi of them becoming weaker, and so Assad's forces were tested. Iranian losses over the past few years are harder to gauge since they operate more through proxy forces. Hezbollah's lost over 4,000 fighters to Israeli strikes and combat operations over the past year, along with losing their leadership of Hassan Nasrallah. The idea is that Hezbollah couldn't help to defend because they have their hands full. Recent reports have supported this claim. Reuters found documents at an airbase that suggested Hezbollah had recalled many of their fighters back home to deal with fighting Israel. These documents also revealed how leadership was barely at the positions, and even some Syrian government soldiers were paying their way out of having to be at the front line. Corruption. It will take down your regime. There's also other information in these documents that stated that the command structure, so like the hierarchy of the Syrian forces, was very much dependent on Iranian and Russian leadership. So once a lot of those advisors were pulled out, they no longer were a cohesive, you didn't know who you answered to. I've been unable to find details on how many numbers of Hezbollah fighters are in Syria. Some sources claim 15,000. Were Assad's two biggest supporters busy with their own problems and overstretched? We would have to know the exact number of force distribution to say for sure. I think this factor also needs to be weighed with the fact that there's been far more internal coordination between the opposition forces themselves, which we're feuding in the past. And sometimes you got to give some credit to your enemy for your success if they happen to be completely incompetent. To give you an idea of what kind of mess we're looking at here, there's a grand total of 801 separate military bases belonging to foreign countries here, including the United States, Russia, and Iran. Basically, it's a big old geopolitical cluster of factions ranging from terrorists to rebels to great powers, all vying for influence in a central location in the Middle East. So, by November 29th, the rebel forces reached Aleppo, cut the key highway off, blocked reinforcements from the south, and the opposition forces' strategy of striking behind enemy lines proved to disorganize Syrian conscripts who reportedly fled in panic, leaving behind weapons, vehicles, jet fighters, even a few modern T-90 tanks. The rebels advanced further south towards the city of Hama, where they netted some real treasure, including an abandoned Pantsir anti-aircraft system and an advanced Podlet K-1 radar system from Russia. To give you just an idea, the Pantsir alone is worth like 15 million bucks, and I'm sure US intelligence agencies are drooling to get their hands on this equipment to research it, which explains why Russia is reportedly concerned about it falling into the CIA's hands. Now, you might be wondering, why, from Russia's perspective, Syria matters to them. Syria is important strategically to Russia because it gives them critical access to the Mediterranean Sea, which is a launching pad for their military operations inside Africa. Russia has a long-term lease on the Tartus naval facility, which is their only year-round warm water port for the Russian Navy. This is vital for them to project power into the Mediterranean. The open source analyst on X named MT Anderson showed satellite imagery from November 30th to December 3rd that revealed that Russia has since removed all of its vessels there following the attacks, which could be an indication that Russia's not planning on sending a ton of reinforcements, although we don't know. It's no secret that in Aleppo, the Syrian government forces collapsed far sooner than anyone thought. Within 24 hours of reaching the outskirts of the city, the rebels had seized the historic citadel at the center and were well on their way to forcing the remaining government forces out. HTS rebels even showed off footage of them roaming the halls of Bashar al-Assad's palace in Aleppo like some kind of bizarre episode of MTV Cribs, Dictator Edition. An indication of how terrible the battle was going for Iran was their brigadier general of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was killed during the Battle of Aleppo. It's their highest ranking loss since 2020. So by December 4th, the rebels had pushed south down to M5 highway and surrounding the city of Hama on 3 sides, laying siege at a rapid pace, but their victory stretches the rebel supply lines and slows their operational tempo at this point. The way I think of Syria is that it's a big old desert in the east where all this fighting is happening, and then just to the west, there's this more lush, wealthy land by the water to the west where the rebels have not been able to get to. By December 6th, the rebels had captured Hama and were on their way to Homs. So everyone was still questioning the rebels' ability to capture the capital city of Damascus, and most analysis at this point in early December still believed that they wouldn't be able to do it. This article by the Atlantic Council said, quote, "As the rebels head south towards Homs, they will be faced with new challenges. Entering Homs provinces requires going through large Al-Wadi communities, many of which are strongly in support of Assad. This poses a challenge for rebels to establish local support." As it turns out, they were faced with very little to no resistance, which goes to show just how shocking these developments were for everyone. Perhaps the most controversial thread of this web, though, comes from Israel's intervention. After the fall of Assad, they started bombing Syrian military targets. Their claim was that this was to prevent fighter jets and equipment from falling into the wrong hands. Israel's Air Force hit a bunch of weapons depots and air defense assets. It's clear to me that they're trying to take advantage of this moment of chaos, like the old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. Israeli ground forces even crossed over the DMZ and secured positions high up on Mount Hermon, which is a strategically important site because of its height, that if you want to put air defense radar assets on there, they have a better view. At the same time as HTS was going on the absolute ballistic blitzkrieg of an offensive, There's one other major stakeholder here that we haven't mentioned yet, and that's Turkey. The Turkish-backed Syrian National Army also launched their own operation against the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces to the east. Even though the SDF are allies of the US forces in the region, Turkey has labeled them as a terrorist organization, claiming that they're in league with Kurdish separatists within Turkey. To make sense of all the overlapping rivalries and shifting loyalties, Caroline Rose, director of the Strategic Blind Spot project of the New Lines Institute think tank, told Voice of America, quote, "It's clear that Ankara, the capital of Turkey, invested in fostering greater partnership between HTS and the SNA to conduct this offensive into Aleppo." Okay, so this is getting a little bit confusing now, if I'm being honest. That didn't really clear anything up for me. I don't know about you. Who are we rooting for here? Turkey's interests in Syria are due to the long border that they share with the country, and the President Erdogan has stated he's concerned about potential overlap and support between the Kurdish people in Syria and the Kurdish political movement in eastern Turkey that might challenge his government. According to the UN Refugee Agency, over 14 million people have been displaced by this conflict since 2011. Many of those Syrian civilians flee north into Europe in an attempt to escape refugee camps. So Germany, for instance, has about 850,000 of these refugees, and that's caused political shifts in Germany. So this is why European countries also have a stake in what happens here, and the United States is concerned about Europe. So, oh my God. It's interesting to note that China doesn't have any forces in Syria, and they're, I think, one of the only major powers not to. I think this is partially because they don't have the force projection capabilities to do it even if they wanted to, and also partly because they don't have any close allies there who have a stake in what happens, really. So it's not like they're protecting their allies' interests like how the United States might be. But regardless of the reason, even if it's just because they don't want to intervene, I think everyone should take a play out of that playbook and not intervene in Syria, as tempting as it might be. Because the Syrian people themselves have clearly shown that they're going to do whatever they want to do, regardless of the various foreign powers intervening there. Assad chose not to go down with the ship. Interestingly, he fled to Russia with his family instead of choosing to stay and fight like some other leaders have done. I think that that's a pretty cowardly move. And of course, forces are going to collapse when their leader doesn't even believe in the fight. You let me know what you think in the comments section. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, signing off this net time now.